Okay, so welcome everybody to the first round of New Zealand Schools Debating Championships for 2020. On the affirmative, we have Canterbury, and on the negative, we have Auckland Blue. Yeah, so without further ado, I'd like to invite the first affirmative speaker to begin the debate.
Can you hear me? New Zealand has been barrelling towards an absolute catastrophe for far too many years. Our dependency on dairy has left us balancing on the edge of that catastrophe, at the same time pouring endless energy into these dairy farms which only produce harmful methane, which only degrade our landscapes and destroy our rivers. On this side of the House, we win this debate by proving to you that now is the time to switch New Zealand away from its massive dependency on the dairy industry by reducing the stock. And we think that that will firstly make us have a more diversified economy that is less vulnerable to those conditions, but secondly, it massively increases the environmental quality of New Zealand as a whole. Our model in this debate is that we think the New Zealand government should take steps over time to significantly limit the herd. What does that look like? Firstly, we think they should limit the amount of size of herds allowed per hectare for in a certain time in the future, right? So we don't think it should be like tomorrow, but in like 5 years, they should say you are only allowed a certain amount of cows on a certain amount of hectares. We also think they should create a number of incentives for people to switch to other forms of land use. That looks like things like other forms of agriculture. That looks like things like forestry. It looks like them being able to switch to other forms that are more sustainable overall. That looks like things like producing crops, etc. We think that they should do this in a couple of ways. Firstly, in terms of creating tax credits and subsidies to diversify. So we think that some should do forestry, some do crops overall. We don't think everyone should switch to a particular thing. We also think there should be government programs to retrain workers when needed. We also think that farmers should have access to the full scale of New Zealand like technologies and assistance from the government in order to be able to switch to the greatest extent that they can. Two main points I'll bring you to then in today's debate. Firstly, how we diversify and reduce dependence on dairy, and secondly, how we reduce the environmental harms of climate change. Firstly, diversifying and reducing the dependence on the dairy industry. The important thing to engage with here is that most of New Zealand's agriculture is dairy farming, even though this is not necessarily the best use of land in many cases. We think in a lot of cases, dairy farming is just seen as a default. Why is this? Firstly, generational. Dairy farming has just become like a generational trend in New Zealand. It's something that your grandparents did, your parents did, and so you want to continue to do it, even if it wasn't most effective in the first place. Secondly, there are existing structures around dairy farming, so Fonterra provides that structure that you are able to get into immediately. There's not many other structures surrounding agricultural use. And second, finally, the culture of dairy farming in New Zealand. All of these things mean that there's a lot of pull factors towards dairy farming, even if it's not the best possible decision for you. And it also means there are very few pull factors towards other forms of land use, right? So other forms of agriculture are less likely to do in the long term. This is very bad for New Zealand in the long term, or even in the short term, because dairy farming in particular is prone to a number of things that could be devastating. Firstly, diseases. This is especially important because the increased use of antibiotics and mass farming, when cows are given like broad-scale antibiotics for their entire lives, means it's even more likely that we're going to see things like superbugs in the future. That looks like Mycoplasma bovis on an even more massive scale that has the ability to wipe out the entire dairy stock of New Zealand. When we're entirely dependent on that stock, that's incredibly harmful. Secondly, things like overseas competition. We think that other countries are probably likely in the future to see New Zealand's position in the dairy market and try to compete with them, right? And we think that probably in 10 years, China will be able to produce far more milk than New Zealand is ever able to and make it much cheaper, or any other nations are going to be able to compete with New Zealand on that scale. Finally, environmental conditions. We think it's incredibly vulnerable to wide-scale environmental disruption. We already see that when droughts every year lead to like thousands of cows having to be culled from herds, when it leads to people losing a lot of money. All of those things mean that that industry is particularly vulnerable. Even if we just think broadly as well, it's harmful that it's a monopoly of the New Zealand industry, that it's not diversified. Yes, I'll take a POI.
How do you think that farmers can easily switch when they've got institutional knowledge about dairy and they've got huge capital investment like milking sheds specifically for dairy? How is that an easy switch?
Sure. So the problem is there that doesn't engage with the comparative, right? Because the comparative is either they switch now with government assistance to allow them to do that, with large-scale subsidies allowing them to switch that institutional knowledge, or they have to switch 10 years in the future at the point at which their dairy is effectively meaningless. They have no capital at all to be able to switch because because the dairy industry no longer exists in New Zealand to the same extent. It's entirely uncomparative to suggest they'll never have to make that switch. They will always have to make that switch. We're just allowing them to do it now at a point where they are more secure in being able to do that. But at the end of this point then, we diversify the economy and land use. How do we do that? Firstly, we just make it less personally profitable to own dairy because you can't overfarm it to the same extent. We think we also offer that subsidiaries and that monetary pull factor. They also have the form of that institutional knowledge that the government can give them, right? Being the government can get experts in to tell them, like, look, this is the kind of agriculture that we think your farm would be especially well suited towards. They have the ability to help them get that capital that they wouldn't have otherwise, particularly to crops that work very well for them. We also think they don't have to switch entirely, right? They can still over time switch more slowly and go towards and do maybe half their farm for dairy and half their farm for something else. We're not talking about extreme change right now. Now, what happens now? We think the New Zealand economy is no longer dependent on a sector that will eventually crash and burn, or even if it doesn't crash and burn, on a sector that will eventually be largely less profitable as it becomes less and less profitable each year, as you see more droughts, meaning that the price of milk goes, that milk is much more difficult to produce. So we have, and as you see in Eg's world, you see that millions of cows producing milk, which is essentially worthless. You see a lot of people suddenly out of work and with no money to help them switch, right? Right now, we give them the opportunity to be able to do that at the beginning when they have an incentive to do so, even if they can't themselves establish that. But secondly then, how do we reduce the massive environmental harms of farming? Because New Zealand isn't actually clean or green, and cows are the worst possible polluter of our environment. There's no way to get around that. They're incredibly harmful. Why is this? 3 key ways. Firstly, in terms of methane emissions. Very basically, cows are the greatest producer of methane within New Zealand, which is a massive greenhouse gas. They are the large extent to why New Zealand is not able to reduce its carbon and methane emissions. I think at the point where you massively reduce the amount of cows in New Zealand, that means you're able to switch to other farming techniques which use less methane, right? Because additionally, we think you're wasting that water and things like that at the point where you create we are also creating creating crops for the cows to eat. Secondly, rivers. We think fertilizers and manure leach massively into New Zealand rivers, leaving them utterly unswimmable, but also leaving them disgusting and really in awful places. That's something that we are now able to fix on our side of the house because there are no longer as many cows creating massive amounts of leaching. Finally, and really importantly, soil leaching and landscape degradation over time, because over-farming and overpopulation of land by cattle massively degrades the soil over time. Why is it the case? We think largely it's because the nutrients and water get leached from the soil at the point where you're constantly farming on it, when there are constantly animals on it. That's not what it's naturally supposed to be like. That means that firstly, paddocks are no longer able to be used over time, right? So as we go on, farming becomes less and less profitable because you're not able to get the same yield from the same paddocks that you would have in the past because you've massively overfarmed those paddocks. It also means it looks like things like the Canterbury Plains now being like a scarred landscape that has no diversity whatsoever, that has no native flora and fauna, and is largely made up of the same plains that are massively degraded. And that means that we get those worse yields. It also means that that landscape is much worse off in the long run. Additionally, it means that at the point where they do have to switch, if they do want to switch to producing crops, they are far less able to do so as the more years we delay, right? So if we wait 10 years for them to switch, we think at that point the soil will be so massively degraded that they won't be able to do so. If we continue to allow New Zealand to massively over-dairy farm, we'll see a landscape made of unusable paddocks turned into wastelands, millions of cows producing harmful greenhouse gases and creating rivers that we can't swim in. Moreover, as soil degrades, will lead to a world in which we are unable to switch. The preponderance and reliance on dairy in New Zealand has been something that's held us back for far too long. It's time to move beyond that.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to now invite the first negative speaker to start their team's case.
Sorry, can you hear me? Dairy is a fundamental cornerstone of the New Zealand economy and props up regions. To side with side affirmative in today's debate would be to deliver the death blow to these regions and fail to actually address any of the environmental problems associated with dairy by moving production offshore. We offer you a measured approach to this issue. What do we support in today's debate? Two things. Firstly, keeping New Zealand's dairy herd at the same size. Secondly, the continued implementation of environmental policies aimed at reducing the impact of dairy farming on the environment. This looks like things like the emissions trading schemes, looks like things like cleaning up waterways and encouraging the use of more efficient and sustainable farming techniques through subsidisation. We're going to win today's debate by proving that as dairy is such an integral part of NZ's domestic economy and trade, this policy will destroy New Zealand's economy and fail in achieving any environmental outcomes. Three substantives for the House. Firstly, why a cull of New Zealand's dairy herd would devastate the New Zealand economy. Secondly, why this policy harms the environment on net. And Kunli will split, telling you how culling the dairy herd has negative political ramifications, both domestically and abroad. But before that, let's take a look at what we were offered by side proposition. Some of this rebuttal will be integrated. Firstly, they told us that farmers can easily switch and retrain, and we'll give them subsidies to be able to do this. Four responses to this. Firstly, we think it's difficult to do this because of the huge amount of infrastructure and like the herds that they've already invested in for years. That means that there's a huge short-term cost for switching. Secondly, we tell you a lot of farmers have specific skills for dairy farming, which aren't transferable to like kiwi fruit growing. Thirdly, we tell you that some types of land, particularly like in the Waikato, is particularly advantageous for dairy farming and provides particular soil and particular conditions for this. It's very hard to transfer that into like farming grapes. And finally, we tell you that even if you concede that their policy could work in like 20 years' time with a long-term solution, they concede that there's going to be huge short-term harms to the New Zealand dairy farmer. We can win on those short-term harms alone, as we'll show you. Their second claim was that dairy farming is a bad form of agriculture and it's harmful to the New Zealand economy. They had two prongs to this. Firstly, they've told us about disease and how it's like prone to environmental conditions. We just tell you that this is completely uncomparative because any form of farming that they want their farmers to switch to also have the same risk of disease and drought. Secondly, they told us that it's not good for exports as our export sector is drying up with dairy. Two reasons why this is just fundamentally not true. Firstly, because New Zealand has a comparative advantage in dairy, meaning that we can produce dairy products at a lower cost than our competitors. This makes us, just on price alone, really competitive in international markets. Secondly, because we trade on the New Zealand brand image of dairy and having a clean, green, high quality dairy product. This is why their point about China having new dairy markets doesn't actually address the fundamental way in which New Zealand sells its dairy products to the world. Finally, they told us about the huge environmental harms of dairy. Three responses to this. Firstly, we think and will prove that policy change under our side of the house just reduces the harms of dairy. Secondly, we tell you that it's worse when you move dairy offshore to less sustainable practices overall globally. And finally, we tell you that side affirmative already have conceded some environmental harms as they support other forms of agriculture like sheep production, even like growing agriculture, which still have huge environmental harms on the environment. Dairy is not exclusive in that respect. Before I move on to my case, I'll take a POI.
Isn't it far worse if it is a disease that destroys much of New Zealand's stock, if, as you claimed, our economy is entirely dependent on that dairy?
No, we think that, look, the risks of dairy are the same as other forms of risk, and we think that new technology is developing to reduce the risk of disease. We haven't had that. We've had a booming export sector for dairy in the last few years, and you still get some of those risks when you've got like growing kiwi fruit. Okay, first substantive then. Firstly, why a cull of New Zealand's dairy herd would devastate the New Zealand economy. Two main areas in this point. Firstly, we tell you that there will be huge unemployment that results from a reduction in dairy. Crucially here, there are thousands of people in New Zealand that are currently involved in dairy. This is not only farmers, but milk tank drivers, milk powder plant workers, and pretty much anyone employed by Fonterra. Importantly, many of these individuals have worked in the sector for decades and do not have skills that are easily transferable to other jobs. When you reduce this key revenue source for these farmers and for these people working in the dairy sector, you get mass unemployment. Why is this so harmful? Firstly, because it particularly harms the regions and further entrenches the inequality between cities and regions, because the harm is particularly felt within regional areas. Secondly, we tell you that we just have a reduction in these individuals' living standards because they're not getting incomes, and there's huge mental health harms to them when they're faced by mass unemployment. But finally, we tell you there's a larger burden on the government to pay them benefits, to pay them subsidies, to transfer to a new form of farming when you decimate them and put them in a position where they face unemployment. Secondly, we tell you that there's a huge reduction in New Zealand's exports earnings from dairy. Crucially, dairy companies provide a huge portion of New Zealand's exports of goods, with markets in China and Asia and South America expanding. It's so successful as we can export not only on lower cost, but on our brand image and sell high quality milk. Why are the reductions of this export so harmful? Two things here. Firstly, we tell you economic growth falls in New Zealand because we have reduced export receipts into New Zealand. This is so harmful because you have a lower quality of life generally, and we can enjoy a benefit or quality of life by less consumer goods, and it's especially important in the context of COVID-19 when the economy is already struggling. But secondly, we tell you that New Zealand's balance of trade worsens because when New Zealand loses the significant export sector, our balance of trade deteriorates as we begin bringing in more imports than we can pay for through exports. This only adds to New Zealand's huge current account deficit, which we already have. Crucially, this is important as we can only fund our current account deficit by having increasing foreign investment, which means that New Zealanders lose control of its assets, or by large-scale government borrowing. That's not something that we support on our side of the house. We want a sustainable economic policy. We deliver that when we keep dairy. Second point then, how this policy harms the environment. Crucially, New Zealand's dairy sector is going to have reduced environmental footprints in the coming years. Why is this? Two reasons. Firstly, because governments and voters want policies that will directly address these environmental issues. And secondly, because farmers and groups like Fonterra want to cooperate and adopt more environmentally friendly policy. We've seen this with the implementation of the emissions trading scheme. We've seen this with cleaning up our waterways. Why does culling New Zealand's dairy herd actually harm the environment? Crucially here, domestic and international demand for dairy does not go away because it's a staple good that many people like to consume, and new markets like China are just emerging and have a new love for dairy. So under our side of the house, what you get is these consumers buy more dairy from less sustainable, environmentally friendly producers. This looks like them buying from US producers, which have no restrictions on water use, use feed and grain that produces more emissions, more methane, and using practices such as battery farming. You shift dairy production globally from New Zealand's sustainable practices that have a reduced environmental footprint to unsustainable practices that harm the environment overall. We support the New Zealand dairy farmer. We support the environment. So proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. We'd like to invite the second affirmative speaker to continue their team's case.
Hear me okay? The main issue with First Next case is that it's a complete straw man of what Lucy said at first. We did not say at any point that we were going to simply switch off dairy and then immediately move to a different form of agricultural economy, as was completely argued by First Neg when he said that they were going to have to go into benefits, when they said their income was going to be immediately switched off. Those things are simply not going to happen under our side of the house. We are for an integrated approach over the course of a number of years in order to move away from a dairy industry which is plagued by the problem that it is not diverse enough to survive changes in the foreign market and changes to the environment. That is something that we have to deal with now and here. What's coming at you in this speech? Well, firstly, we've got sort of 3 points of clash. most firstly is the impact on the economy and what it's going to do for New Zealand and what we're trying to do and protect here. Secondly, we're going to talk about the impact of the transition and how that's going to work. And finally, we're going to talk about the environment, and then that's going to lead me straight onto my split, which is going to be about how the impacts of climate change are going to make dairy unprofitable for New Zealand in the long run. So firstly, on this impact of dairy as being the cornerstone of New Zealand. And the most critical point so far that we had, and the key mechanism, is that New Zealand is the most competitive country at doing this. And that may have been true in the last 10 years, but that doesn't mean it will be true in the future. Let's look at New Zealand's logic here. If you're going to export something from New Zealand, you have to pay for it to be moved from this side of the world to wherever the person that's going to buy it is, whether they're in China, Europe, North America. That is incredibly expensive on the consumer, and it means it is not cheap for them to buy. What that means is it opens it up for another superpower, be it Russia or China, which has huge amounts of open space. If they want to start dairy farming, then that means that they can produce milk at a far lower cost. It means that they can then send that milk on at a far lower cost to the consumer. And New Zealand's dairy market is wiped out overnight by a superpower that is able to come up and undercut the New Zealand economy. That is what we're trying to protect here. We're trying to protect the New Zealand economy by diversifying our agricultural industry, which if we don't do, we open our entire agricultural sector up to that undercutting happening at any point. That is something that uniquely sits on our side of the house. The other kind of areas we had here is that New Zealand, we gave you that New Zealand is prone to disease, and they came back on this by saying that all cows, by saying that every option is going to be impacted the same. What we tell you is that all cows are impacted by say mycoplasma bovis, and when you have millions of cows, every single one can be impacted. No, thank you. What that means is, though, if you switch to crops, only one crop can be impacted, or if you have a variety of different cattle, or variety of different animals and crops on your farm and your sector, it means only one small part can be impacted. Therefore, you reduce the overall impact. The second part is that we sell off New Zealand's brand image. What we tell you is that New Zealand's brand image isn't that great. It's mainly because we're the main option, right? New Zealand's brand image got impacted by mycoplasma bovis, got impacted by the poisoning at the Fonterra plant of milk products. These things, our brand image isn't what makes us attractive to sell. It's because we're the main exporter of milk, right? So that means that it's not New Zealand's unique brand image that someone uses when they buy the milk. They don't go to the supermarket in Europe and go, oh, that milk's from New Zealand, that's why I'm going to buy it. That's not the reason that they use when they buy the milk. It's because it is the main option or the only option on the shelf in front of them. Oh, thank you. This brings me on to my second point, and this is the a mischaracterization we had around the transition and how that's going to work. What we had is that what we had coming in here is that people have specific skills, and that is going to be hard for them to switch. That is why we justified this by saying that the government is going to be able to support schemes that allow them to switch their skills and switch their knowledge base so that they can diversify their farm, which benefits them in the long term, as we've proven in, so far in our case. What does that mean? Well, it means because you have a long period to learn these skills, the transition happens over time. That means that overall you end up with a wider range of skills, and means that you can diversify your farm even more, which is innately good. No, thank you. Then we come on to this notion that we have the types of land are better suited. We absolutely support using, say, the Waikato as a more of a dairy hub because it is better suited to the land because the environmental impacts are lower. But that doesn't mean the Mackenzie Basin needs to be used as a dairy hub, which it is at the moment. That has a huge environmental impact on an area of land that is not suited to dairy farming. These are the types of things that are why we want to diversify rather than continuing to plug the ticket. Then we come on to this idea that we're going to have lower living standards. This is based off the idea that you're just not going to have an income but while you switch. That is totally not true, because it's not like the government or we're proposing for you to come in overnight and take away your cows and take away your means of production. No, thank you. What we're saying is that over time, you're going to be able to switch. Over time, that means you move to more diverse ranges of income. It means that one season you start to bring in a smaller population of sheep at the same time as you reduce your cattle population. It means over time that you start to plant more crops, you have more range of income sources. That is something that is good because it means all times of the year you are producing income. It means that all times of the year you're producing more income, regardless of the season, regardless of any factors, regardless of international markets. That is something that is good for farmers. Then we finally come on to this third point, which is that it is worse for the environment if we move away from New Zealand's sustainable practices and move, let's say, to China, which isn't going to use sustainable practices. What we tell you is that we innately care about New Zealand's environment. We care about whether our rivers are clean, because it is our rivers that we care about. Most importantly, we don't really care whether China's rivers are good or not. The reality is they're not good anyway because they get industrial waste put into them. So it doesn't really make any difference, right? What we care about is whether the Waimakariri River is having cow nitrates being put into them on a daily basis, is having fertilizer put into them on a daily basis. We tell you that we clean up our rivers, and that is something that you conceded by shifting the topic to the overseas market. We are able to improve the New Zealand environment immensely. We offer the ability to do that while protecting the future of New Zealand's economy. I'll take your POI.
If your next point is going to be about climate change, which affects the entire world, why should New Zealand shift the burden of this dairy farming overseas to less sustainable practices?
Fantastic point, and that brings me straight onto my split. And that comes in on the idea that climate change is worsening. We cannot do anything about that, right? Whether we take action in New Zealand or not, we absolutely can see we can't do anything in the big term about that. But what dairy farming is it is a massive, massive burden on New Zealand, because if we continue with dairy farming, all our eggs are in one basket again, and dairy is particularly vulnerable to to climate change impacts from dairy. So what does this look like? Well, in climate change, we're getting more and more storms, droughts, wildfires, floods. All those kind of events are happening more and more. What is unique about these events is that they're incredibly hard to predict. You may only be aware of these happening at max 2 days before, say, a storm or a flood, and a fire could happen at any time. Those kind of things, these are happening more and more frequently. It's something that you just have to live with. This is bad for dairy. How is it bad? Well, it means that, no, thank you. It means that innately, what it means is that these events are happening more frequently. So it means that you're more likely to be impacted by a flood a couple of times a year. It means you're more likely to be impacted by severe storms a couple of times a year. What does that mean in terms of dairy, right? So if you have a bad, firstly, it means you have to clean up your farm, because operationally your farm has to be in a good condition to work. So that means the government's either going to have to chip in, or the farmer's going to have to chip in. If you have to do that several times a year, that is not sustainable for you as a farmer. But more importantly, in terms of dairy, say if we have a storm and you have 1,000 cattle on a particular unsheltered paddock, as they mostly are on the Canterbury Plains, all your cows are going to move into one area, your paddock gets flooded, and you don't have anything to feed them with, because the grass has been completely waterlogged, right? This is now no longer sustainable to have 1,000 cows on that particular paddock. It is not sustainable for you to have all of your eggs in one basket of cattle. What that means is, while you clean up, you are not able to take any milk from the cows. You do not have an income. This is going to happen more and more frequently. It means you cannot sustain having those cows at that time. You may have to lose part of your herd in that event. This is not an ongoing sustainable practice for New Zealand to have. Alternatively, if we diversify the impacts on a more wider range, it means that you are going to be able to mitigate those impacts. One area might be impacted while another continues to be profitable. All we do is, in the end of the day, is we protect New Zealand's agricultural industry. We protect New Zealand's farmers, because we agree that they're a cornerstone of New Zealand's economy, and we protect them for the longevity of the agricultural industry for the many years to come.
Thank you very much for that. Would like to invite the second negative speaker to continue their team's case.
Can you guys hear me? Panel, don't let the Affirming team today fool you, because today's debate is not about subsidies, is not about tax credits, is not about the long-term shift of the New Zealand economy. Today's debate is about literally systematically killing cows and taking capital away from the hardworking farmers in our economy. That's what today's debate is about. That is a very short-term effect, and all the tax credit subsidy stuff is symmetrical. That's something we can do in the long term as well. I'm going to talk about 3 things in this speech. Firstly, how does this policy affect the New Zealand economy? Secondly, how does this affect the environment? And thirdly, I'm going to talk about political ramifications. So firstly then, how does this policy affect the New Zealand economy? The first thing they told us was that there was like historical pull factors that mean that farmers are making bad decisions. Why is this not the case? Firstly, we tell you that farmers are like all corporations, obviously making decisions that are good for the profit of that business. They're obviously making decisions that they know will benefit them. Sure, there are like institutional pull factors or historical pull factors, right? But that's exactly why the New Zealand dairy economy, dairy industry is so efficient, right? So like generational knowledge or like strong dairy institutions are benefits in this debate, because they're exactly the types of things that means that our dairy industry is so efficient, is so good that like even if they don't get more dollars per per like pound of meat or whatever, like they still know that it's more efficient because they have access to these institutions. That's not a harm in this debate. So if it like, and the second thing to say here is that if these institutions, if these pull factors are so strong, then like even if you cull a lot of the proportion of these farmers' stock, they're probably going to stay and continue in these dairy industries. So they still like have those harms. The only difference then is maybe they have slightly less cows. So let's talk about that then. Because the next thing they talked about was the risk of disease. We just think this point is slightly ridiculous, right? We don't think that reducing the number of cows is going to make that population of cows any more like risk immune to disease. In fact, if anything, by reducing the population of animals, you're increasing the risk that that population has to that disease. But then the next thing here is, right, if you diversify your agricultural economy, right? So you invest in a lot of different like crops or a lot of different animals, you're only making each of those different populations more risk averse to diseases because you have like less different gene strands, less different species within that population. So like, if anything, the risk is symmetric because you just now have a lot more different populations of risk averse like plants or risk averse animals. Whereas if we had like a strong like economies of scale, large population of cows, this means we can have a lot of different like gene strands of cows, a lot of different breeds of cows. That means that we have a strong, large population that is actually immune to doesn't get wiped out because there's not a large enough gene pool. That point's ridiculous. Next thing here to say here then is that they say that in the long term, like these dairy farmers are going to become less efficient because of China. Look, we don't understand why farmers aren't able to make the decision to switch industries when they know that it's unprofitable for them at that point in time. Look, we don't need to kill like half of their cows for them to realize that in 20 years, like dairy farming is going to be unprofitable, right? So like, what is this? So things like tax credits, things like subsidies, these are all things that the New Zealand government is able to implement in the long term if they realize that it is the case that China is like producing dairy really efficiently, right? So that means that like we can minimize the harm of like killing all of the cows, but while still reaping the benefits of having an economy.
Point of clarification.
Risk averse. Yes, sorry.
So do you stand for culling New Zealand's herds in the future, or just like you don't want it to happen right now?
We don't need to cull cows for these farmers to know that these cows are probably unprofitable, right? So if it is the case in 20 years that like farming sheep is more profitable than farming cows, there's no reason why these farmers can't just switch industry without their like cows being like systematically killed by the government. Okay.
On that
is brand image, right? Because they said that New Zealand doesn't have an existing brand image. This is just completely wrong. Consumers in China, consumers in the US, consumers in Europe literally choose New Zealand dairy products because they know it tastes better, they know it's produced more efficiently, they know it's cleaner and greener. That is literally a major point for our side of the house. Okay, let's move on then to how this affects the environment. Because they had several claims here about how like we overfarm the land and that's not sustainable in the long term. Several things to say here. Firstly, we contest this characterization that New Zealand is like destroying its environment. New Zealand literally has the most sustainable farming practices in the entire world. We literally have the best land to cow ratios of any industrial, like commercial production of farming. That's just simply not a valid characterization. But secondly, we tell you that over farming can still occur when you diversify the different crops or the different animals you're farming, right? Because you can still over farm wheat or still over farm corn, right? That is still something that you can do.
On that point,
is that these industries are less regulated than dairy. It means that these farmers are probably able to like exploit loopholes that exist because the New Zealand law isn't written well enough for like regulating corn industries. And also, thirdly, these farmers are just not with these crops, right? So they're going to be a lot less efficient. They're probably going to waste a lot of fertilizer or waste a lot of like waste their land when they're farming these crops. They're probably going to be a lot more inefficient when they diversify and shift literally the entire industry away from something that they've been working with for literally generations. So at the end of this point, we tell you that these inexperienced farmers, these farmers who like don't know how to farm these certain crops or aren't as experienced, probably going to be more efficient, probably going to damage the environment even more simply because of the fact that they don't know how to use it properly. And the last thing to say here is that why would a farmer
on that point,
make profit in the long run ever choose to destroy their environment so they destroy their farm so they're never going to be a farm on it again? That's a question that they need to answer on their side of the house. Okay, now I want to talk to you about political ramifications. Because we tell you that there's two important things for you to consider. Firstly, domestically, this policy fundamentally undermines an enormous group of people that live in New Zealand. Literally almost everyone living outside a major city in New Zealand is touched by the dairy industry. Whether that's a mechanic who repairs farming equipment, whether that's a cafe owner who serves laborers, whether that's small accountancy firms that do the accounts for these small dairy firms. If we alienate these individuals by taking away a significant proportion of their capital, it means that we're going to have significant political divides within that country. What does this look like? This looks like rises in populist, extremist, anti-establishment politicians. This looks like regional drifts between Auckland and the regions and gridlocks that prevent the government from being able to do anything because of the political divide that exists within that country. That's an important consideration in this debate. The second thing is international politics. Because we tell you, it's no secret that the dairy industry literally props up our relationships with global superpowers like China, like the US. Chinese people and the people from the US buy New Zealand dairy products because they know it's super high quality, they know it's trustworthy, they recognize the brand of New Zealand. This means that the New Zealand government and the New Zealand industries are able to use this industry as a negotiation tool when they're drafting international negotiation deals. This means that New Zealand becomes a high priority place for high and low skilled laborers who can come to New Zealand to fill our labor market shortages because they know that New Zealand is a great country to go to. But secondly, it also allows New Zealand politicians to get into the room when it comes to international trade negotiations and political deals. That's an extremely important consideration in this debate, because if we lose that power, we're never going to achieve the outcomes Affirming wants to get. So at the end of this debate, we're the side that saves the economy, we're the side that saves the environment, extremely proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. I would like to invite the third affirmative speaker to conclude their team's case.
Sorry, I've got so much paper, I need 2 desks. My coaches are so proud of me. It's amazing.
Hey, you've got a timer. That's enough.
I've got a timer as well, Will. We're absolutely killing it. Okay. Lucy, I'm going to send your failed intro.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm good now. We're going to go. To paraphrase Lucy Jessup, we are barreling towards an utter catastrophe. The world is going down because of climate change, and the other team has failed to engage with us in this debate. And in fact, by telling us that there are all these harms, that they agree with us on that, they have conceded that all of our harms that we've brought you actually do exist in this debate. So what have I got for you today, apart from great puns? I've got 3 points of clash. Number one, what's going to be worse for the economy? Number 2, what's best for the environment? And secondly, responding to their backlash split. So number 1, what's going to be worse for the economy? What did we actually hear from them? Well, we heard that there are going to be short-term harms. This is what we heard from Isaac, that there's short-term harms, and that these short-term harms, they outweigh the long-term harms. So if we prove them, we're going to win the debate. Let's break this down, okay? So these so-called short-term harms that we've brought you, and we've acknowledged there are some harms to it. However, we've minimized them a lot, we've shown you. And in fact, these harms are going to happen regardless. Regardless of when we do them, these harms are going to be there. And in fact, they're going to be far, far worse if we push them aside, push them to the future like Neg would want us to do. So why is this? Well, number 1, climate change is going to make things worse. And we are better off to dealing with it now with things like government intervention, with things like subsidy, because we're in the position right now to go and say, hey, yes, we have the money, we have the resources to let people do that. No, thank you. We have the resources to let people actually gradually move out of farming rather than the economic bomb that the other team would like us to have. In fact, let's talk about that comparative. The comparative would have us unsustainably dairy farming until, well, the New Zealand economy crashes. Why will this happen? No, thank you. Number one, we're going to see competition from somewhere like China or Russia, who have the land. They have the land, they have the people, they have the resources. All they need to do is snap their fingers and our entire dairy industry is screwed because they can provide it at a much cheaper cost. And I'm going to touch on the brand image stuff later.
On that.
But then, even if you don't accept that, you have to accept that the diseases that are coming in with things like Mycoplasma bovis are only going to become bigger and even worse with things like superbugs and the antibiotics we pump into cows. And then, even if you don't accept that, you must accept that climate change is going to get worse and worse and worse so that catastrophic events like floods, like droughts, like storms that impact dairy farmers, as Callum told you, are only going to become more frequent. They're going to happen every 6 months, every year now, which means that it's going to become even more unsustainable for farmers because they're having to pay $500K just to sustain their business out of a drought. I'll take your POI now. No?
Sir, when climate change is so important and it could literally drown some of our Pacific neighbours, why is it justified that New Zealand shifts the burden of climate change and shifts it to more unsustainable producers in the US, in China, in South America?
We would much rather that New Zealand stands up and says, hey, we're not okay with this anymore. We're not okay with profiting off the backs, of our Pacific Island nations drowning. We want to make that stand, and we are going to make that stand so that the rest of the world can see that, and the rest of the world has a lower climate change harm in this debate. So then what else do we hear? Well, we heard that somehow our debate is going to end, our model is going to end with right-wing populism. In fact, we're going to throw that bone back at you, because when you have an economic bomb the size that you're talking about, where the entire economy is going to stop because you've unsustainably dairy farmed until it's not sustainable at all anymore, even economically, you're going to have a huge bomb, and that leads to right-wing populism because people are out of work at a much greater rate than under our gradual system, where people get retrained, where people can slowly build into going out of the dairy industry. So what have I proven at the end of this point? Well, I've proven that the short-term harms are far outweighed by the long-term economic bomb that's going to wait for us, and the long-term environmental bomb that the other team would much rather have us have. In fact, all of the harms that Neg have brought us that won't happen under our model because it's gradual and because it's an aided and slow process to get us there to a more sustainable economy will happen, and they'll take place ×3 under their model, where we're just going to walk into the economic bomb where everyone's out of work and no one has any money for all the fun lifestyle stuff that we heard at first. So what do we get? We get a worse world with much greater risks under their side of the house. And we do not stand for that in this debate. So now let's address some of the other things. Since I've broken down their entire mechanism, let's break down some of the other little fun things they've thrown at us. Number one, NZ's brand image. So this is all I've got left after I've broken that stuff down. What have we heard? We've heard that we've got this brand image and it's amazing. So let's break it down. People aren't going to care about the New Zealand brand image when our brand image costs the consumer like 5 to 6 times as much as any other export that they can buy in the supermarket. If you're going to the supermarket and you're in I don't know, Romania, and the only 2 options are New Zealand milk, which costs $8, and Chinese milk, which costs $1.50, the likelihood is you're going to go for the Romanian, the Chinese milk that costs $1.50, because yes, our brand image is bloody amazing, but the people care more about the cost and the lower cost that you're going to get. So you've told us that New Zealand's got all these sustainable things, and I'm going to get into this, to offset dairy industry. Those things cost money. Those things end up meaning that when it comes to Romanian supermarkets, New Zealand dairy costs a lot more than Chinese dairy. That means that all of your benefits about New Zealand being the sustainable one don't stand in this debate either. It's nice that I brought that up. So then, what else do we hear? We heard this was an absurd thing, that disease is just as likely with fewer cows because there's more gene strands with more cows. Let's address this just really quickly because it's not important in this debate, but I had to do it. Number one, we're just breeding cows together until they're inbred. That's what we do in New Zealand. We're not going out here and importing cows from all different countries so we have diversity. No, we're just breeding them till they're inbred so they're more susceptible to diseases. That's what's that right out of the way. But even if you don't accept that, what we're trying to do in this debate is deprioritize cows in our economy, meaning that if we have fewer cows, if there is a disease, which there's just as likely to be under any side, it won't be such a huge hit to the New Zealand economy because we're diversifying through our gradual and measured approach to changing the economy. So on to second point of clash. What's best for the environment? Well, we've already got emissions trading schemes and cleaning up rivers. This is what we've heard. Now, these are band-aids to the real issue here. These are expensive band-aids to the real issue here. The real issue is the cows. You remove the cows from the situation, you do not have to clean these rivers anymore, or at least not to the same extent that you do under their side of the house. We can't keep cleaning our rivers while letting cows leach into the rivers. It's a Sisyphean task. I'm very proud I said that. When we can really just hit the root of the issue and take these cows out of the economy in a substantial way. And we've shown you all of the economic environmental benefits through this. Then we also heard that it's going to be less regulated under crops, and that crops are just as bad and they'll damage the economy, the environment, because these people don't know what they're doing. Quickly, these people do, even if they don't know what they're doing as much as other crop people, it's still far outweighed by the damage that cows do to the economy. Then very, very quickly, backlash. We just heard rural versus urban divide makes it worse. This is all rubbish. What we need to address in this debate is the environment. We cannot continue to barrel towards an utter catastrophe. In fact, we can't barrel towards an economic catastrophe like the other team would like us to have. And more importantly, we cannot let our Pacific Island nations drown for our economic benefit. And frankly, how can you?
Thank you very much for that. We'd like to invite the third negative speaker to conclude the substantive portion of the debate.
The Affirmative team in this debate essentially undercuts all of their own arguments when they tell us that the impacts of climate change on future dairy farming will be so bad that it will never ever be profitable again. Essentially what this means is that they then also have to accept that all of those effects that happen to dairy farming also occur for basically any other agricultural yield, so droughts and things like that will also affect those, which necessarily means that if they want to accept those the long-term unprofitability of dairy farming, they also have to accept that they're going to switch a huge portion of the New Zealand economy away from agriculture entirely and to industries where they don't have transferable skills and when they're unable to make a profit. Two main points of clash for the House today in this debate. Firstly, on the economic impacts of the motion, and secondly, which side gets better environmental outcomes. Let's begin then by discussing the economic claims that we've heard. From AF, we heard that the industry of dairy farming is guaranteed to collapse and essentially become unprofitable in the future, and that it's so susceptible to unexpected fluctuations in the environment. We tell you, firstly, let's discuss this idea that climate change makes it so unsustainable to do dairy farming. We tell you that if climate change makes it hard to dairy farm and the mechanisms they've given us apply, and we accept the mechanisms they've given us, then it's necessarily true that it makes agriculture hard in general, because we don't accept that it's like that cows are any more susceptible to a drought than any other crop or any other animal. So the claims about the ease of retraining them to use their land for other crops or other animals simply
Grace.
don't hold. No, thank you. Then let's discuss. Let's take this and discuss what it means for their benefits that they try to claim them. We tell you then that if these dairy farmers do switch to a different agricultural industry, those industries that are switched to will still be susceptible to fluctuations. They try to combat this by telling us that, hey, like your farm can diversify. You can have different animals, and you can have like 10 different animals and 10 different crops on your farm. So for any disease that comes in, only one of your animals or one of your crops is affected. We tell you that this completely undermines efficiency. That's simply not how farms operate, because it's just, you don't have the necessary infrastructure needed to both milk cows, which need like milking sheds, and breed sheep and produce like grain and wheat and rice. It's simply not the way that farms work. So it's completely ridiculous to say that those farms will be able to like simply adjust themselves to any random disease that comes in. Secondly, then, if we accept then that they are going to have to switch away from agriculture entirely because agriculture becomes like unprofitable and unsustainable in the long run, then we necessarily accept that there are barriers to switching that look like the change in infrastructure and the change in skills needed. So you do get a decrease in employment. The Affirmative tried to have their cake and eat it here and eat it too when they tried to tell us that those skills are transferable, because either you transfer to agriculture, which they claim is unprofitable, or you have to transfer away from it, which results in unemployment. That results in the harms that Isaac told you that they never fully engage with, other than trying to brush them away. This looks like a reduction in the standard of living. This looks like the government having to pay extra unemployment benefits. And crucially, if you switch entirely away from agriculture, you completely devastate all of our regions who depend on it. We're like rural farmers whose entire livelihoods and whose entire lands, whose entire assets and everything they own depends on being able to farm, because they're not just going to be able to become like a software developer living up in Auckland. We think that at the point at which those inequalities exist, it's not something that we're happy to stand for. Then let's discuss how this affects our exports. Kunle told you that they were able to make this decision down the line, but this actually has a comparative. So either, because we've contested that it's not necessarily true that dairy becomes unprofitable. If it does become, in the off chance that it becomes unprofitable in the long run, we think those farmers can make that choice when they're guaranteed to know it, because they're going to suffer economic consequences if they make that choice irrationally and when there's no definitive proof that it's going to harm them. But then let's discuss why it's not actually true that it's going to be unprofitable. We told you that New Zealand has schemes that ensure the sustainability of dairy farmers. This looks like the Dairy Tomorrow scheme, in which farmers are cooperating and buying into government schemes about making their dairy more sustainable. This also looks like the fact that New Zealand has a significant comparative advantage. We don't accept Affirmative's claims that Russia or China can simply enter the market of dairy farming whenever they wish.
On that point,
like, for example, for Russia, they're never going to have the climates needed to produce dairy cows at the same rate of efficiency that New Zealand have. For China, they're also not going to be able to produce it. And we think that's obvious when we consider the fact that if China was able to produce it and able to bring all of its rural villages out of extreme poverty, then they already would have done so. But it's simply not true that the climate necessary in China is the same as it is here. That means then that New Zealand necessarily has a comparative advantage in exporting milk. And there's always going to be this demand for dairy across the world, because we have a growing middle class that is demanding dairy at a high rate. Let's discuss then the idea of brand image, which we think also ensures that New Zealand's dairy will always be profitable in the long run. They tell us that you're never going to care about brand image when it costs you an extra $2 or $3. We tell you this isn't true. And this looks like the idea that China is our main, China is the main importer of dairy, of New Zealand dairy. Chinese people love the idea of New Zealand's clean green image. They buy into the idea that they're buying things from New Zealand, which is a country that they look up to and aspire to be, because Chinese people like the idea of New Zealand. They like New Zealand chocolate, even though it's not the cheapest chocolate out there, because they think that the fact that it comes from New Zealand makes it better and makes it something that they're likely to engage with.
Grace.
No, I'll take you in a second. So at the end of this, then, we tell you that New Zealand's dairy industry is likely to be profitable in the long run. Yes, I'll take that POI.
Yeah, so Grace, surely you recognise that with all of the kind of sustainable tools that you're on your side is the only way you're going to fix climate change that you're going with, the New Zealand chocolate is only going to become more and more expensive to the point where it's not even a valuable export
We
for
don't
us
think
anymore.
that's necessarily true. We think the amounts of R&D and research that's being done into sustainable practices means that it's not ridiculously more expensive, means that you might suffer like a 30-cent increase in like a block of chocolate, but we don't think that's actually going to have the kinds of impacts that they like to claim. We think that they're just trying to overblow those impacts for their side. Let's move on then to the second point of clash around the environment. The negating team here, the affirming team here simply tries to say that they only care about New Zealand environment. They only care about New Zealand rivers. And the second speaker says that. And then the third speaker tries to switch that by saying, hey, we need to care about our Pacific neighbors who are dying in the Pacific Ocean due to climate change. The first response is tell you that it is completely ridiculous to say that we don't need to care about anyone else. Because the point at which like climate change starts devastating our atmosphere, starts devastating our air, and starts devastating everything that we own, it's not going to matter if our rivers are clean, because it's never going to create a clean and like livable atmosphere or environment for New Zealand. But then let's discuss how this affects overseas people. We tell you, as Isaac told you, and it's completely unresponded to, if New Zealand stops producing this, you're simply going to switch to offshore production. We tell you that New Zealand has the emissions trading scheme. It has Dairy Tomorrow. These are schemes that have government buy-in, have public buy-in, and have buy-in from farmers that ensure they're likely to be successful in the long run, because it's a collective and collaborative endeavor. We tell you that if the responsibility to the Pacific nations exists, it doesn't mean shirking our responsibilities by saying, hey, we're not going to like be in the industry of dairy farming anymore. It says, hey, look, we're going to make our dairy farming practices sustainable to protect you guys from the big companies in the US, for example, who are not going to care if you're going to suffer climate change, who are not going to care about making their practices more sustainable, and who are only going to care about maximizing their profits for the sake of their bottom line. At the end of this debate, we're the side of the house that actually protects the New Zealand economy and protects the environment on a global scale for all citizens of the world to enjoy. We're proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. As is customary at this point in the debate, we reverse the speaking order, so I'd like to invite the negative leader to give their reply.
Can you hear me all right? Panel, let's be very clear about what we've supported down our line. We've supported keeping dairy herds at the current level, and we've told you for various reasons that dairy will still be profitable in the long run. But we've said in our case that even if it is not possible in the very long term, like 50 or 60 years, we think that if dairy becomes less profitable, we can transfer then. Farmers can switch and we can offer government subsidies to them then. What side have to support in today's debate is having this transition right now when we've got a booming export sector that is very reliant on dairy and when dairy is so profitable. Crucially, panel, the free market means that if dairy becomes unprofitable in the very long term, farmers can gradually switch and governments can offer assistance then. That's what we support. They've got to support rushing this change through right now. That's not something we can stand by. 2 points of clash in today's debate. Firstly, whether this policy harms the global environment, and secondly, whether culling the NZ dairy herd harms the New Zealand economy. Let's firstly take a look at the environment. Their key claim under this was that dairy farming is really harmful to the environment and has harms for like New Zealand rivers. Two responses to this. Firstly, we've told you right down the line that we're getting genuine progress on our side of the house when we're introducing new policies, and like it's within our fiat to introduce even more of these policies, assuming the huge changes that SIDAF want to make. But secondly, we tell you, and we've told you right down the line, and this is where we win today's debate, that there's such a large harm to the global environment when New Zealand taps out of the dairy industry and shifts the burden of producing dairy onto producers who are far less sustainable, who produce far more emissions, who use far more water. That is not something that we can stand by in today's debate. Now, their only response to this was pretty much, oh, New Zealand should always prioritise its own waterways. We don't really care about anyone else. Why then is it so important that we should care about the global environment and climate change as an issue? Two reasons for this. Firstly, because the harms of climate change in other countries are particularly harmful and are going to be worse than any pollution of waterways. This looks like islands literally going underwater. We think New Zealand is in a privileged position, and this action is in line with our values as a government to help the world globally. We're not isolationists historically. Secondly, we tell you that climate change directly affects New Zealand because it makes all agriculture more difficult. It leads to higher temperatures in summers and colder winters, far larger droughts. So even if you want to accept side Affirmative's characterisation that we should only care about New Zealand, you cannot cast your ballot in their favour in today's debate because climate change is an issue that affects New Zealand directly. Okay, now that we've shown that we improve the environment, let's take a look at whether culling the NZ dairy herd harms the New Zealand economy. First claim from them was that there are problems with dairy as a sector in New Zealand. Two responses, one key response to this. All of these problems with the export markets and with like drought would indicate that we have no dairy sector under the status quo. But clearly farmers realise that it is profitable, it is good for them, at least for now. They are producing dairy. We think that that's good enough for it to be a profitable sector. That's just a sense check on what they were saying. Then they told us that New Zealand will be hit by an economic boom when dairy fails. Two responses to this. Firstly, we've given you lots of analysis down the line about why dairy can sustain the New Zealand economy, trading on our lower costs and brand image. But secondly, we tell you that any change in production that happens in 50 or 60 years' time won't be an economic bomb. We just don't accept that characterisation from side Affirmative, because what it looks like is farmers gradually deciding to transition and slowly moving and getting government support then. What we have won this debate in is in the short term, because we reduce short-term unemployment. We promote short-term economic growth, and we've crucially don't worsen New Zealand's current account deficit, something that SIDAF has failed to address. So proud to oppose.
Thank you very, very much for that. I'd like to now invite the Affirmative leader to give their reply and conclude the debate.
Can you hear me? The negating team lost today's debate when they tell you that, oh, if farming becomes less profitable in the future, farmers can just switch. Because we told you all down the line that farmers are no longer able to switch at the point where they no longer have any of that capital or any profit for them to do. We tell you all down the line that we stand on the cusp of the failure of New Zealand's dairy farming industry, and we think that is far more beneficial that we switch now rather than them who just choose to bury their head in the sand and continue to go along with it, eventually leading to the downfall of that industry. Two main points of clash then into this debate. Firstly, the impacts on the New Zealand economy. Secondly, the impacts on the New Zealand environment. Firstly, impacts on New Zealand economy. We tell you it's particularly important that New Zealand makes a switch right now because the dairy industry is more vulnerable than it ever has been before. Why is that? Firstly, diseases. In response to this, they just chucked economies of scale at you. We tell you that we pump antibiotics into cows. We tell you that they're all like inbred and very susceptible to diseases. All of those things mean they're very susceptible to things like Mycoplasma bovis. An important thing that they never engage with, right, is that when we have a massive dependence on cows, we aren't switched to any other forms. That means that we're massively vulnerable to that. Secondly, global competition. We tell you New Zealand has rested on its laurels for far too long, and especially when they tell us there's a growing demand for dairy in China, there is a niche to be filled. I think it's especially vulnerable to that global competition, especially, and those countries can do that in about 2 seconds because they're able to produce milk for much cheaper. We also tell you that prices go up massively with the impacts, as we told you in a POI. Thirdly, climate change. We tell you droughts, floods, and storms get even worse, particularly though when everyone is dependent on their cows, right? Because they just never actually engage with the context of what we brought you, right? They just said, oh, all those harms are symmetric. We tell you it's not symmetric because at the point where you are only dependent on cows who are vulnerable to a particular kind of drought, a particular kind of flood, we think that that's incredibly harmful because you don't have other forms of agriculture that might be able to survive. And finally, we tell you that over farming of New Zealand land means that yields get worse every year because farmers only care about those short-term benefits. It means that those paddocks no longer have the same yields they used to. What does this mean? This means that the really nice impacts that Isaac mecked out for you about the people losing their job now all happen in 10 years' time, right? When that dairy industry collapses. And they're far worse for people. What alternative do we offer you? We offer you a transition to a more diversified economy. Why do we think farmers won't just do them themselves, as the second speaker tried to tell you? We tell you because they wanted to have the cake and eat it too, right? And say, oh, well, now they're just going to do it themselves. We tell you, we offer the opportunity for them to do it more gradually. We tell you they will do it because if, as they say, we wait until Chinese milk is far cheaper, farmers have no capital and no ability to switch. They have no ability to slowly transition because suddenly their milk is all worthless and they aren't able to sell it anymore. We far prefer our side of the house where we make that switch to the point where they are still able to do so. What does this transition actually look like then? They tell us that institutional knowledge is really important. We tell you we take all the institutional knowledge that government scientists have and advise farmers how to switch to particularly efficient crops that will be good yields for them. Why does this point matter? At the end of this debate, we were always happy to concede there was going to be some short-term harms. We were always willing to trade those off on the massive long-term benefits that we receive because we tell you it's much more important, firstly, that we're able to head off all those harms in the long term. We also tell you that now New Zealand's economy is able to take some smaller term hits that are gradually spaced out over time, as opposed to the massive loss that occurs at the point where a disease sweeps through the cows of New Zealand. Secondly, impacts on New Zealand environment. Look, we told you right down the line that we care most about preserving New Zealand's natural environment. They gave you a brand new principle framework at Leaders where they tell you now we only care about net climate change. We conceded that climate change is probably inevitable on both sides because coal is still being burnt, etc. We tell you what we actually care about is things like the pollution of rivers, things like the large-scale degradation of land, where it's left essentially as wasteland and deserted. The only response to this was to say, wow, we can do magic technology. We tell you at the point where you have far more cows per hectare than is ever sustainable, you are never actually able to deal with that. At the end of this debate, you are left with a ticking time bomb in which New Zealand is increasingly going towards an economic downfall, but you're also leading to far worse sustainable and less sustainable farming practices overall.